Hi, everyone. Welcome to the UCLA-Caltech MSTP info session. We're so excited that you're here to hear about MD PhD programs and specifically the UCLA-Caltech MD PhD. We have a great panel of students and also our two co-directors here to give you all the information you need. And yeah, we're just going to get started with a presentation from Dr. David Dawson and Dr. Olujimi Ajijola, who are the directors of our program, where they'll give an overview of MD PhD, what that is, and also specifics about our program. I will put the link to the agenda in the chat, and if you have any questions throughout the session, please be sure to submit those to the Q&A function and not the chat, so that we can be sure to see those questions. Last thing, if you have any remaining questions afterwards, we'll send a link out where you can submit those. And this session is going to be recorded, and so we'll send you the link out afterwards for that too. So let's get started. I want to welcome Dr. David Dawson, who is one of our co-directors of the program. He is a wonderful, wonderful leader, and we're so happy to have him and Dr. Ajijola here today. So Dave, you want to take it off?
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up, Julia. Great. Thank you, Julia. So as she said, I'm Dave Dawson. I'm an MD PhD, and I'm a co-director of the UCLA-Caltech MSTP. I'm going to take this presentation in two parts based on the sort of questions that we received beforehand. I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about the MD PhD career and career track. And then I'm going to step in and talk a little bit more about our program specifically. So with no further ado, let's get started. So my path to becoming a physician scientist. So this is a sort of timeline of my training. And I think you can see here that I went to undergraduate at Duke University. Then I went into an MD PhD training program at Northwestern University, followed by a pathology residency and fellowship training at UCLA, a postdoctoral research fellowship, as well as a clinical instructorship at UCLA, and then became a faculty member in 2006. So the time from undergraduate to graduate was quite long, a long road. College and then additional 17 years of education and training before I had my first, what you would call, independent faculty position. So this is not for the faint of heart, this type of training, but I want to tell you that it was worth it. So, you know, I learned a lot and made a lot of important discoveries along the way. So it wasn't like I was just sitting in a classroom for 17 years while I was receiving this training. I was actually doing very meaningful work. I'm very proud and love what I do. And I would stress also finally that, you know, I'm not wearing two hats here. I'm not a physician and a scientist. I'm a physician scientist. So I would stress that my clinical duties very much intersect with my research responsibilities. So I'm a practicing surgical pathologist. I'm a GI pathologist specifically, and my laboratory is focused on pancreatic cancer, which is part of the GI tract. And those two specific responsibilities are merged very nicely in my research and allow me to be productive. So let's just take a little step back and talk about the types of biomedical research that are out there. You'll hear these terms thrown around, but I think it's worth discussing these really quickly so that we can understand why you might want to do an MD PhD. So there's obviously basic science research, which is, you know, advancing our understanding of basic biological processes, molecular biochemistry and whatnot, typically involving studies that are in silico, in vitro, or in vivo, sometimes model organisms. But then there's, on the opposite end of the spectrum, clinical research, which is really working with patients and evaluating the effectiveness of diagnostics and therapeutics in patients, sometimes and oftentimes in collaboration with pharmaceutical companies and other medical device companies, and then everything in between. So disease-oriented and translational research. So these are research activities that are designed to advance knowledge and our understanding of biological processes that are involved in human disease. They frequently will involve animal models and or human tissues or patient-derived cells or models, but also in the present era very much extends to computational modeling and analysis of human-derived data. And really the focus of this type of research is to translate basic science discoveries into clinical applications, or taking clinical questions back to the laboratory to make important discoveries. So, you know, there are different paths really that you can take to pursue the goal of pursuing biomedical research. And it really, you know, the path you choose really depends, in, I think, large part on the types of research that you might want to do. So, you know, obviously, if you're going to work with patients, you're going to have a medical degree in most instances. If you have a PhD or a master's and want to work with patients, you're going to probably have to do that in collaboration with physicians. And so that's sort of a limiting factor of pursuing biomedical research in the, you know, in the PhD setting. Medical MD physicians only that do not get a PhD, now they can very easily pursue disease-oriented or translational or clinical research. It's a little bit harder for them to pursue hardcore basic science research. It's possible, but typically they have to gain additional experience after they get their MD to pursue that training. And so what MSTPs and MD PhD programs do is kind of marry these two extremes into the best of both worlds in many respects. So the MD PhD training includes MSTP programs, which are NIH-funded MD PhD programs. Typical period of time for training is 7 to 9 years. This is 4 years of medical school. You cannot really reduce that number of medical school years, and somewhere between 3 to 5 and sometimes a few years more of graduate school. It's funded training. You receive tuition fees and stipend, including your medical school phase of your training. That's fully covered by MSTPs. You know, the career path after you get an MD PhD typically involves pursuing residency training, which can be anywhere from 3 to 8 years, depending on your specialty and the type of program you go into, followed by further MD fellowships and postdoctoral research training for additional years. And then finally, you know, an academic appointment typically will have to require significant protected research time for you to be successful. So to get in these programs, just to be very blunt, requires, you know, good academic work in college. So a strong GPA is important, but in addition, the type of coursework you're doing is a consideration when you look at your GPAs. Strong MCAT scores, typically in the 80th or above percentile, but these can be higher or lower. It really depends on the total applicant you are. So we engage in holistic reviews, as do most programs. We're considering the entire picture, and your grades and your MCAT scores are only part of that picture. If you're applying to MD only, there's additional factors that are really critical in that regard. And in particular, it's clinical exposure, your leadership activities, and your community service are really stressed in medical school evaluations of applicants. In MD PhD applicants, however, the primary focus we're interested in is your prior sustained research experiences. And so typically you want to have had sustained research in one or more labs. You have to have a deep understanding of the work you did in those labs and a really good understanding of the background that underpins that work. It's helpful to have evidence of productivity. This could come in the form of publications or expected publication. It's really critical that you get strong letters of recommendation from your research faculty. So why should you really think about an MD PhD? Really, you should be very passionate about science and have a strong fascination in particular with human biology. You know, you should find it fun and interesting. You should find it to be an important way that you engage your creative side. An MD PhD is an opportunity to potentially have a huge impact on patients. So you can expand medical knowledge, develop new technologies, and discover and improve medical treatments in ways that don't impact just a single patient that you're seeing, but large populations of patients. And honestly, it's a portal to a variety of career settings. So, you know, the classic one is the academic scientist in a university medical center, but there are many other places that you'll find MD PhDs once they've completed their training. You'll find them in industry and biopharma and biotech. You'll find them in non-academic research institutions such as the Salk Institute. You'll see them in government, at the CDC, at NIH, at FDA, or other places. You'll see them involved in scientific writing, blogs, media, and editing. You'll see them at regulatory agencies, and you'll see them involved in policy, whether they're involved in lobbying, NGOs, or other things. So it's really tremendous sort of background to have to go in a variety of directions. I think there's some advantages and disadvantages we need to talk about up front, MD versus the MD PhD, and it's really critical as a solid competitive applicant that you understand these advantages and disadvantages. And so some of the advantages of an MD PhD training is that you get formal PhD training, which is formal in-depth research training, including coursework and a thesis defense that really focuses your basic science or your translational training in a way that's a little bit more difficult to obtain by an MD after they've gotten their MD. It offers outstanding job prospects, an opportunity to perform cutting-edge research based not only on a deep understanding of basic science, but also current medical practice. And to be fair, it offers also subsidized education. But I would really stress to you here that if you're considering finance as the reason for choosing an MD PhD over an MD, that's not a good reason to do it. So really the point of the subsidized education is to basically lower the disincentive to pursue MD PhD training over MD training, not to actually compel you to do it. I hope this makes sense. So there are some important disadvantages also for pursuing the MD PhD path. So it takes a long time in training. As I mentioned, it was literally 17 years before I actually became an independent faculty member with my own research laboratory. So you're deferring your own program and your own independence, as well as your earning potential early in your life. It's absolutely clear that having multiple responsibilities can be difficult to balance, particularly competing professional goals as well as competing personal goals with your professional goals. So you need to really understand that. It's hard to understand that on the front end. The best way to get a better handle on that is to talk to people that are actually doing it. So find people to have a conversation with and have them describe to you what their life is like, what the pluses and minuses are. So I mentioned this before in passing, but it's really impossible to think of this as two individual jobs. If you pursue it that way, it's a recipe for failure. Really, if you're trying to be an MD and a PhD separately, you're competing with people that spend all their time doing MD or doing PhD. It's going to be impossible to basically compete against those people effectively if you're trying to do it in both arenas, as opposed to basically putting them together and merging them into a single practice where you take advantages from each and develop your own specific goals and objectives in the path in your career. And so I actually also think another disadvantage of the path is that it requires you to make some concessions with your career goals and your eventual job. For instance, if you really want to spend all your time taking care of patients, that's not really what you should be doing as an MD PhD. You actually have to require or limit your clinical duties to some extent. So if that's something that doesn't appeal to you, it's probably a mark against pursuing this path. And a lot of these activities, these sort of balancing your research and your clinical practice, are sometimes actually not under your control. They're under the control of your directors or bosses in the hospital or in your department. And so it can be sometimes difficult to really find that balance, even if you're actually seeking it. So let's see, I'm gonna close this show. And I'm going to move on to a little bit about our program. And I can take a few questions, I suppose, at the very end. So a little bit about our program, the UCLA-Caltech MSTP. So our program was established in 1983. So it's actually entering its 39th year of consecutive NIH funding. So it's been around a long time. So we're a legacy program. We currently have 113 students in our program. We're a large program, one of the larger programs in the country. We're accepting about 13 to 15 applicants per year, and we've grown quite a bit in the past decade, so by about 50%, but I think we're probably pretty much at our steady state size at this point. So you can expect us to accept about 15 applicants per year. We've been in a partnership with Caltech for 24 years. We send a minimum of 2 students each year to Caltech, sometimes more, but typically 2 students a year to Caltech to do their PhD training. And in the mid to 2010s, we established a social sciences track. So this is training in the social sciences, anthropology, sociology, history, and other disciplines in the social sciences, with a recognition that social determinants of medicine are really very important and critical for outcomes in the medicine and in the general population. And our first cohort is going to graduate in 2023, and we have nearly a complete full class now of social sciences students in our program. They're a great part of our program, but they're distinct from the students that are training in laboratory settings. What does our program have to offer you? I would summarize them in the following 6 points. I think we offer exceptional clinical and research training, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. I think we offer tremendous flexibility for you to pursue your specific research interests, and that's only been facilitated even further by the new medical school curriculum, which I'll mention briefly as well. We have a very strong emphasis on mentorship. We have multiple directors and co-directors in our program that allows us to provide more individual mentorship than we otherwise would be able to do with a program of our size. We give students of our program a strong voice in the program's direction and its leadership. And I'll mention several student committees in a second that have really helped shape our program in the last few years. We have a strong commitment to JEDI that comes at both the institutional level and the program level. And I really hope that our students will agree that we try to foster a sense of family and community in our program. So I think the proof is in the pudding, the fact that we have exceptional research training. Our students truly excel at our institution. Currently, our students are averaging a little bit more than 5 authored papers when they graduate, including 2 to 3 as a first author. And in the last several years, when we've looked at that best first authored paper from each of our students, it's typically been in a journal with an average impact factor of 14.2, which is an incredible feat. 14.2 is in really strong journals like Neuron and Immunity. So it's you know, they're doing they're highly productive both in terms of the quality and the number of papers they're publishing. A high percentage of our students are receiving individual NRSA awards or similar extramural awards. So even as students in our program, they're already competing for extramural funding, which basically sets them on the glide path to future success for securing funding as independent investigators down the future. There's numerous honors and awards they receive every year. There are too many to name, but you know, we're really proud of how our students perform, and that high performance and their strong skills are really recognized on the institutional level and on the national level with various awards. They match at amazing residency programs. I'll list those in a second. And the vast majority of the students that graduate from our program do go to successful careers in academia. So at currently about 60 to 70% of them are in some type of research activity in academia. Or they are involved in industry or government research. So this is just a quick listing of match results from the last several years of students in our program. I think for those of you that are in the know, you can see that they are matching in highly competitive residency, specialties, and programs. There's a tendency for our students to match primarily on the West Coast and somewhat on the East Coast. And that's just a reflection of where the strongest programs are. And I think when people come and live in California for a long time, they have a tendency to stay because California is a wonderful place to live. And so I think you see a lot of our students end up staying on the West Coast once they come here to train. Just a few points about the training environment. I would like to highlight our institution, including the School of Medicine, the UCLA Health System. So our hospital system is the #1 hospital in California and consistently ranked in the top 3 in the nation, according to U.S. News and World Reports. You know, in those rankings is the fact that we are highly ranked across research, primary care, and multiple clinical specialties, as well as on various diversity indices. It's a very large place with accomplished clinical and research faculty, nearly $1 billion in grant funding in the portfolio last year, including over $500 million from NIH. It's a really competitive medical school that you're applying to as you apply into our program. The largest number of applicants of any medical school in the country. So a year ago, 13,000 applicants for literally 175 seats. So you're in good company if you get into this institution. So in addition to having our primary quaternary care hospital, the Ronald Reagan Hospital, there's a variety of clinical settings in which our trainees get clinical exposure, including various county, VA, HMO, and other settings. And this is important because it exposes you to the range of clinical practice, the types of patients that are encountered in various settings, and allows you to sort of tailor your interest in terms of the types of clinical training you're going to get as part of your clerkship training during medical school. We have a really large and outstanding research enterprise here. I've listed several centers and institutes on campus that really are the basis for collaborative research across the institution and cutting edge research across the institution. I would mention also that the School of Medicine a few years ago reorganized its research in terms of themes to facilitate further collaboration, actually bringing investigators together with common interests. And so I've listed several of the research themes on this campus that are really the basis for training and where you'll do your research if you were to come here. I mentioned that we offer flexible streamlining training. And second, I'll describe that there are multiple points of entry between the MD and the PhD phases of your training. And we do a great deal to support those transitions between MD and PhD training. We've negotiated with the graduate programs to reduce the amount of coursework that you're required to do to get your PhD. Of course, you're spending significant time being educated in medical school, and there's a lot of overlap in that training. And so we try to limit the redundancy in the training in your PhD phase of your training so that you can graduate in a timely fashion. And we're very supportive of unique opportunities you may want to pursue. So in the last several years, several of the students in our program have pursued career development opportunities, whether it's been industry sabbaticals or actually going off to do company startups. So Alice Zhang was a member of our program a few years back and co-founded a company up in the Bay Area. So we're very excited and supportive of these activities because it is the future of science. Just to mention about the new curriculum, I'm not going to go into great detail about the UCLA School of Medicine curriculum. You can go to their website and learn about it. There's lots of interesting videos to watch. The short of the long is that the traditional 2 years of didactic learning followed by a clerkship year and then an elective year in the hospital has been replaced by a single 13-month-long didactic phase of training, which is the MD 1 year. And so the traditional medical student, the non-MSTP student here at UCLA in the second year of medical school is already going in to do their core clerkships. And then in their third year, they spend about 8 to 10 months pursuing a passion or interest. And this could be research or other activities, such as global health or other policy approaches. So it's a sort of a capstone project year for them. And what that means for our students is they kind of wrap that into their PhD training and it allows us to graduate students more quickly. So we've essentially almost got an entire year back from the medical school for our students to train in the research labs or in their research projects. And so this curriculum is a bit interchangeable. There are students in our program that will go straight to the laboratory after finishing their first MD year, but there are some students who will do a few core clerkships before going into the lab and then go into the laboratory. And then there are some students who will complete all of their core clerkships before going into their research years. And so there's a lot of flexibility. You can tailor it to your specific needs. In particular, for instance, if you're in the social sciences track or you're an individual who's going to go into a laboratory that does a lot of translational research who would benefit from a lot of clinical exposure and experience, you might want to do that second MD year first, and we are supportive of that. We offer a lot of mentorship in our program. Each person who's entered into each student in our program has one designated faculty mentor in the program. It's largely based on your research interests. We have 6 faculty that serve in that capacity, and we meet with you formally multiple times each year and whenever you need to speak with us. We have lots of class-specific check-in meetings with the program directors. We have an online individual development plan that allows you to set goals and track your progress towards those goals that you review with us. We have a mentorship that occurs on the student level. So we have established student families, MSTP student families, which are cohorts of students across all the years that have shared interests that can basically share their experiences and give one another advice and guidance. We really have several committees that really are student committee run committees that are importantly facilitating connections with faculty on campus, other mentors that are really based on your specific circumstances and needs. And then we also have various alumni databases and networking events. I mentioned that our students run and help shape the MSTP. And so these are the list of the committees that we've actually formulated. And I think their names pretty much define what they do. We have a diversity and outreach efforts committee. We have an education committee, a mentorship committee, a social committee, which Julia's oftentimes been involved in, student admissions and recruitment committee, which so students are very actively engaged in interviewing and recruiting individuals to our program, and then a women in MSTP committee as well, focused on the specific needs and interests of women in science and medicine. I mentioned before that our program and our school and institution are heavily committed to JEDI. We actually, as a program, have established a summer pipeline program for undergraduates with a specific goal to increase diversity in MSTPs across the country. It's a significant part of our admissions and recruitment efforts, mentorship, career development, and so on. We like to have fun with each other. We have lots of formal sort of scientific focused activities as well as fun activities. We have summer barbecues. We have an annual research conference. We have a Monday type research tutorial where we bring our younger students together and feed them dinner and have them listen to various faculty on campus talk about their research so that they can identify laboratories that they might be interested in pursuing their PhD in. We have a retreat every 2 years that happens on the beach. We actually just had it a couple of weeks ago. And then we have various student committee sponsored events and a lot of ad hoc events. So the students are constantly getting together and doing stuff together through social media. So just a few last slides and then I'll finish. You know, this basically boils down to what are we looking for in an applicant? So what makes a good MD PhD applicant? So number one is really you need to have immersed yourself in an outstanding laboratory focused basic science or disease oriented research laboratory. And in that experience, you should really expect to work hard. You know, you're going to be working evenings, weekends, summers are also a great time for research. It needs to be a prolonged research experience. Just dabbling here and there is not sufficient because you really want to show that you got into your research and understood your research. So be sure to read papers, know the background of the science that your laboratory is pursuing and your own specific research project inside and out. This may be a project that you are personally assigned to or a project you're working on with a graduate student or a postdoc in the laboratory. And it's really critical that you make yourself an invaluable and known quantity in your lab. What do I mean by this? So attend your lab meetings. Always ask thoughtful questions based on an understanding of the science and the literature. Be a good lab citizen, be a good team player. All these things are going to come through in letters of recommendation that your mentor writes about you. So of course, do well in school, get excellent grades. Don't spend so much time in the laboratory that your grades suffer. So grades are an important factor, but they're not a primary factor. We use many criteria, a holistic approach to evaluate students for MD PhD programs. And this includes how you're performing in your productivity in a lab, either as an undergraduate or as a post-baccalaureate. It's also important that you remember that you're applying to an MD PhD program, so you do need to have some clinical exposure. But let me stress that for MD PhD programs, we're focused primarily on clinician scientists, the latter being on scientist. So you need to understand what a physician does, but it can't be the only thing in the primary thing you're focused on. This is very different than if you're applying to MD only programs. If you're applying to MD only programs, that clinical exposure becomes much more important. I think that a good applicant for an MD PhD program has all the same qualities as an outstanding scientist: curious, inquisitive, out-of-the-box thinker. You have to be organized, able to multitask, able to solve problems, approach research with integrity and with ethics, evidence that you can overcome difficulties with grit, resilience, and hard work, and that you're committed to the process. It helps to be ambitious and show that. And ultimately, I think you really need to love the scientific process, and you need to really convey to us that you can't imagine life without it. So if you're not really jazzed about science, maybe consider just going and doing the MD. If you really if you can't imagine your day without thinking about science, then I think an MD PhD program is a really good fit for you. Some parting thoughts: how to identify a research lab that's suitable to get the training and background you need to apply to an MD PhD program. Obviously, consider the research interests of the lab. They have to align with something that you can get excited about. Consider how the lab mentors people and what its track record for helping individuals like yourself get into programs, whether it's medical school or MD PhD programs. Obviously, prestige, size, funding, the culture of the lab are all important. But I think most importantly is the opportunity to have some opportunity to take personal responsibility in a project, either a portion of one or a project that you can call your own, that you can really highlight when you apply to MD PhD programs. Questions about whether you need to do additional work after you graduate, it really depends on your individual circumstances. Some of you may be coming from institutions where the opportunity to do research were limited, and so it may make sense to do some post-baccalaureate research work to strengthen your research resume. It may allow you to shore up on some other deficiencies, like a slightly lower college, academic performance, and probably most importantly, help you decide whether research is really right for you. So if you haven't had enough exposure yet, maybe taking a year to do some exploration is really helpful and important. Your personal statement is really critical. You really need to demonstrate in that statement your rationale for pursuing this path. You also cannot hide your deficiencies. If you have any issues in your application, this is your opportunity to provide some context, how you've overcome it. For instance, if you did poorly in the first year of college, but then improved, you can explain the reasons why you stumbled at the beginning, but then improved. Really tell your personal story of how you've overcome any challenges and how your life has really brought you to this place. Make it about you. So the letters of recommendation are very, very important for this particular application process. So strongly consider who and what they will say about you. And it's probably important to ask them if they can write you a strong letter. If they can't tell you that they're able to do that, then I would go someplace else for a letter of recommendation. Some other things to think about: any meaningful or formative clinical experiences. This could be something you've actually done in the professional setting, like shadowing a physician or clinical volunteering, but it might be your own personal experiences or interactions with physicians and scientists. Leadership and service is helpful. I would also suggest and strongly support that you give a really strong rationale for why you're applying to a specific program, not just to MSTP programs in general. Really outline the reasons why you're applying to UCLA or Harvard or wherever it is you're applying. Okay. So also be clear that you understand what the MD PhD path is about and what the outcome is for trainees and if it is a right for you. So I would just point out that there's some excellent articles online. In particular is one MSTP director at Penn named Skip Brass, who's written a lot of really good articles that kind of describe the outcomes for MD PhD programs, as well as whether the path is right for you. So I have a specific reference here that Skip wrote a couple years ago that is the basis for a lot of the thoughts I've shared for you today as well. So I would just recommend you go to that as a starting point. So with that, I will stop sharing. Are there any questions? I don't know if you want to.
There are quite a few, Julia.
Okay.
Julia, do you want to moderate?
Sure, yeah. And by the way, this is Dr. Olujimi Ajijola, who is our other co-director. And thanks, Dave, for that really comprehensive presentation. I think it covered most of the questions that we got, so that was wonderful. One question is, how many students apply to our program specifically every year?
It ranges between 350 and 450 applicants a year.
Okay. And then another question that we've been getting a lot, with COVID and the pandemic, a lot of students are having difficulties getting clinical experiences or shadowing or even research opportunities. What advice do you have for those students who still want to put forth a great application?
Ollie, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can start, and definitely please add in, and also, just even before I start saying that, I want to also make sure that our students get an opportunity to answer questions.
Yeah.
Number one is I'll say that, it's almost like in anything else where you're competing to be the one that stands out. I think really being as creative as you can and really thinking outside the box. So there have been things where people do virtual clinical experiences. This is one approach some people to take is to actually get a job as a scribe to really get into the clinical setting. And just again, think broadly about where you might pursue that experience: emergency room, someone's clinic. And then one thing that I've seen people do also is actually work as a nurse's aide. Because that really puts you right at the bedside and gives you a very, very unique perspective. So the biggest advice I'd give for the clinical side is really to think outside the box, be persistent, reach out to as many people as you can to get that exposure. On the research side, that can also be difficult. But again, think outside the box. There are research experiences that are maybe more bioinformatics based, where a lot of the research is done at a computer. Some of it is clinical database type research. So these are a few other opportunities that are out there, and I'll let some of the co-panelists add to this.
Perfect. And then we have one more question just about social science track applicants. How many do you normally get? And is there anything you wanted to add about that program? We'll be going into it and hearing from Daniel in the student panel as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Daniel answer a lot of those questions, but I will tell you that we have Joel Braslow, who's one of our associate directors, and then a cohort of other faculty that are involved with the Center for Social Medicine that are very actively involved in sort of screening those applications and interviewing those applicants. And so the decisions are largely based on their impressions and not Olu's or mine, because we are not in that area of research investigation. And so it's very thoughtfully considered. It's obviously a much smaller number of the applicants. When I said we get anywhere from 350 to 450 applicants, I would say 10 to 15% of those applicants are probably are applying in the social sciences track.
Great. And then one last question about diversity and outreach in the program. So what action is being taken to welcome more historically marginalized groups into a program like UCLA-Caltech?
Dave, do you want to start? You highlighted some of the things on your slide already, but maybe you could reemphasize that and I can add in.
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, a very important thing is holistic review, and opportunities that present themselves aren't equivalent across the entire applicant pool, and so that is something we take into account. That distance traveled is a really critical factor, and actually an outstanding factor for measuring your ability to overcome adversity and succeed in a difficult program such as this. And so everyone we accept into the program essentially performs identically. So once you get here, you do well, and so we understand that. I think one of the issues with sort of having a diverse class or cohort of students, and from diversity, I think we aim to be as diverse as the community in which we live, right? And so we're not all the way there yet, but we're working to get closer to there. And I think one way we need to do that is to increase the number of applicants from traditionally underrepresented groups. And so we've done a great deal of outreach, and in particular, we've established a program that's very specifically designed to expose students to MSTP or MD PhD track training. And I'll let Olu talk a little bit more about it, because he's actually taken over that from the previous director of the program and has actually really grown it quite a bit in the last year. So Olu, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, all great answers. Yeah, I'll start off with the summer pipeline program that we have, as Dr. Dawson mentioned. This is now its second year, but what we're doing is really broadening our reach. We're not just only looking for people that are coming from the high tier schools. We're also looking for really just a diversity of applicants. So that includes reaching out to community colleges, to Cal State universities. I always tell people I actually started off in community college myself. I think most people don't know that. I didn't start off at the four-year university. So I think really giving everyone a chance to be an applicant. Other things that we're doing also really trying to create a sense of community within the program, just to know that any and everyone, regardless of what their underrepresented status is welcome in our program, and really making sure that, we pay attention to everyone's, needs and interests, and again, creating a community that supports everyone. And maybe let me stop there and see if actually maybe even if the students want to add anything.
Well, I would just also add, programming and mentorship is a big part of this, and based on your backgrounds, the best advice you might get for how you're going to navigate this training in your career would be to talk to someone who comes from a similar background as you. So we're trying to facilitate those interactions as well, in a way that we, maybe previously hasn't happened in academic medicine.
Perfect. Well, I think we covered all the major points, and I know you both are really busy, so we'll transition over to the student panel. Thank you so much, Olu and Dave, for giving this talk and stopping in. We'll see you guys later.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you all for coming.
All right, now don't leave yet. This is when the party starts. We have the student panel, and so we're going to stay on, answer some questions, and talk a little bit more about the student experience and what it's like to be an MD PhD student at UCLA-Caltech. But first off, I just want to have everyone introduce themselves very quickly. Just say your name, your undergrad, if you took any gap years after college, and then what sorts of research or clinical interests do you have? If you don't know right now, that's fine. Fitz, I expect you to know by now. And also year in the program would be helpful. So let's start with George.
Hey guys, it's a pleasure to meet you all virtually. My name is George Daghlian. I'm a first-year student in the program. Before coming into the program, I did my undergrad at Caltech, and then took a year off to do a little bit more research. With regards to research interests, I'm interested in either neurobiology or neuroimmunology, and potentially medical engineering. So we'll see how things turn out. And then clinical interest, I think anything surgery would be interesting. So we'll see how things pan out with regards to clerkships. But yeah, it's a pleasure being here.
Awesome. Jacqui, you want to go next?
Sure, I'll go. Hey, everybody, I'm Jacqui. Also a pleasure to be here. I guess first thing is I went to Johns Hopkins University. I did 2 years in terms of a gap year, or I took 2 gap years, I should say, at the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT, so in Boston. And my current research interests, which are subject to change because I am a first year, but we'll see. Hopefully they don't change too much, but I think at this point, neurogenetics is where I'm kind of leaning in proteomics. And then clinical interests, opposite of George, anything that's not surgery. So that's where I'm at, but everything else I think I'm really interested in at this point. So I'm excited to see where I end up. But yeah.
Awesome. Daniel, you want to go next?
Hi everyone, my name is Daniel. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a PhD 2 in the social sciences track in the Department of Anthropology. And I did my undergrad at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. And I did take several gap years. I took 3 gap years, I believe. Happy to talk more about what I did during those gap years. My research is in the sort of subsistence strategies of severely mentally ill folks receiving community mental health services. And so I look at kind of the unintended consequences of deinstitutionalization in psychiatry, excuse me. And really my research is also wedded to my clinical interest, which is psychiatry. I don't think that's going to change because I'm, dedicating a lot of time in the PhD looking at mental health delivery systems. So yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you. Kristie, you want to go next?
Hi everyone, I'm Kristie. I'm a PhD 3 in molecular biology, and I study how the gut microbiome affects the brain. I did my undergrad at Caltech, like George, and my clinical interests are internal medicine and endocrinology.
All right, and Fitzgerald.
Hey everyone, my name is Gerald Diala. I went to UC Riverside where I studied biochemistry. I had 1 year gap, I suppose, during which I applied. I didn't do anything research related at that time, worked really in the realm of mentorship. And I just graduated 4 days ago. I don't know. Is it 3 or 4 days ago? I don't know. Good to be here. I will be an ophthalmologist in training at Vanderbilt University.
Yes, so we have both students and now recent alumni on this panel. Fitz is a doctor, which is what we're all aspiring to be here. Just briefly, my name is Julia. I'm a PhD 1 and I went to Emory, didn't take any gap years similar to Kristie. And I'm interested in immunology, not sure where I'll go clinically just yet. And so when we say MS1 or PhD 1 or whatever, the way our program works, like Dave mentioned, is you do your first 2 years of medical school, then you jump into the PhD, which could be anywhere from 3 to 5 to 6 years, depending on your program. And then you go back into the medical school part. And so you could be called an MS3 or MS4. It can get kind of confusing, but that's where we're all at. All right, so I first wanted to start by asking everyone, what really got you interested in MD PhD programs? How did you learn about it? And what sorts of things did you do in college and also in your gap years to prepare? Anyone can start.
I'll go. I wanted to be a physician as a kid. I had a faculty who suggested I consider doing research, and I was doing that, and I liked it. And then I was having difficulty deciding what to do upon graduation. And then I remembered that I'd been in a seminar class for biochemistry majors where one of the topics was, what do you do with your major? And I remembered that we talked about MD PhD, and that sort of kind of set the stage. And as I learned more about it, it felt like it was the right approach for me at that time, because I wanted to not only learn how to take good care of patients and work on healthcare infrastructure, but I also wanted to understand science, and as such, scientific infrastructure for thinking about environments wherein there isn't good science. So that's how I decided for myself.
For me, I wanted to do a PhD first, and I actually got interested in MD PhD programs because I worked for a lab where the PI was an MD PhD, and he studied rare bone diseases and had a very translational approach where he took samples from his patients and grew them into induced pluripotent stem cells to study the disease. Because of how the disease progressed, you couldn't really get other samples besides skin cells. So I think that approach really inspired me to want to do something similar that could make a difference for my patients, like through research. And then I switched in after my sophomore year of undergrad to wanting to do MD PhD.
I feel like for me it was a little bit later. I was always interested, like Fitz, just going into some sort of a medical field. But I think it was hard because on one hand, I really loved research, and I think part of the reason I was interested in medicine was because of research, kind of that mental flexibility to be able to understand mechanisms and explore fields. But when I heard of upperclassmen, probably midway through undergrad, kind of exploring MD PhD, I think that was what really excited me, because before that I was like, oh shoot, I have to decide on one or the other. I can't really do both. So yeah, I think that was what really sealed it. And I think it was another thing where towards the end of undergrad, seeing a clinical case during shadowing kind of inspired one of the projects I ended up working on for senior thesis, and seeing that connection between like something in the clinic and kind of being able to explore something in the basic science setting was something very interesting. Yeah, so I think that was kind of some of the things that led up to an MD PhD, but for me, it was definitely much later than others. Yeah.
I can talk a little bit about my path because it was a bit windy in undergrad. I didn't do the pre-medical requirements in undergraduate. I was also not a science major at all. My major was, oh God, what did I major in? Anthropology and Latin American studies. So I very much was just like in a very different social world. I always had an interest in medicine in high school. And then when I got to college, I didn't even try doing the pre-med like requirements there, just because I was kind of scared of falling flat on my face. I had seen my brother kind of fall flat on his face. Although my brother, you know, everything worked out for him. He's now a resident. But I kind of saw him like really struggle, because pre-medical, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It can be really difficult. It can be really challenging. And so I kind of pursued other interests while I was an undergrad. And I was on track to go into academia to do a PhD, actually. I was in a kind of research fellowship in anthropology, specifically oriented towards like getting people into academia, and just became kind of disillusioned with the idea of just kind of sitting in an academic ivory tower. And so thinking about kind of doing something more kind of practice oriented again. So I revisited, when I graduated, I kind of revisited my interest in medicine, and I ended up working as a community mental health worker for like a year and a half. Similarly, had different frustrations in that space, kind of thinking about, there was certain needs that I could, care for a patient in front of me, but the kind of larger structures around them that were causing them to be ill frustrated me, in that, what I was doing was just kind of a Band-Aid at times. And that returned me into my interest in academia. And so I really thought about the ways in which I could kind of unite these two approaches. One that, you can, do something about somebody's immediate need right in front of you, but also like work on kind of someone's surroundings by like identifying the structures that are leading to someone being ill. Similarly, I think, I don't want to speak for other folks who are not in social sciences, but I think there might be sometimes, I think that theme is relatively common among folks who want to do MD PhD, is kind of uniting two different approaches. And yeah, that was kind of my path. So that was kind of my trajectory. So, if you're in high school and you're undergrad, just know that there are many ways to get to this place. So don't think that you have to pursue one cookie cutter way.
Really quickly, I'm going to go just because everyone else is gone, but I just want to say, I think I'm pretty similar to George and Fitz, but Daniel, also what you mentioned about the idea of wanting to help somebody kind of immediately, but then also knowing that maybe there are other ways that we just haven't discovered yet. And there might be ways that at least, how do I say this? There might be things that we're actively doing that could be done better in the future, right? And so having a seat at the table where we can see all of these discrepancies and how it is that things are done now, but also where there might be a specific need for patients is kind of a unique position, I believe, that MD PhDs get to see, because we're interacting in the clinic and we're also then figuring out questions we want to answer either at the bench side or in the field or whatever kind of area of research you want to go into. So I think that's one reason why I want to do MD PhD. Another one, to be perfectly frank, is I love being a student, and I picked the longest path to just constantly be able to stay, be at least kind of a student for the rest of my life. Because I think when you're in academia or in an MD PhD, one, it's a long track, but two, you're always asking questions, and you're never going to have mastered your field because there are things we just haven't discovered yet. And the goal is not to master it. The goal is just to always want to learn and always be curious. So I think that that's really what drew me to being in this kind of program. So yeah.
Thank you guys so much. And also just to touch on kind of MD, PhD requirements and maybe some things that you can be thinking about getting involved in college if you're at that stage or in your gap years. I mean, all of us, as you heard, we all did research of some kind, whether in college or after college. And so try to find a lab or a project that excites you. And then also service is a big thing, like Dave talked about, whether that is clinically related service or something completely different. I think med schools really value that. And then have some clinical experience if you can, whether that's shadowing or volunteering in some sort of clinical setting, just so that med schools know that you know what it's like to be around the patient population and you can speak to really why you want to be a doctor. So those are some things to keep in mind. Next, I want to ask the panel, why did you choose the UCLA-Caltech MSTP specifically?
Mine is easiest. It was the only MD PhD program I got into. I applied, I was a very late applicant. Don't apply late to things. But I applied very late and, it was wonderful. I had interviews that were really I had last interviews for places that did offer me interview. And then it's close to home. So the decision I had to make was MD versus MD PhD. So I had options for both. Well, I had more options for MD, but so when I chose to do MD PhD, ultimately, it made sense to go with the offer that I had. And I will add that, thereafter, I think I didn't really know anything about how competitive anything is and all that, right? Because I was very poorly informed person, kind of worked out, and times are different, right? Everything is now rolling admissions in many places. Things were different almost a decade ago, right? So you have to be mindful of how times are changing. And so I think I grew to appreciate all the differences and the advantages and how great this program is after I came in. So I think I might have been a tad scared if I knew all those things ahead of time, but different times.
I'm from California, so I wanted to stay in California to be close to my family. To be honest, I feel really lucky that I'm in LA and I'm from the Bay Area, so I get to see my family pretty frequently, and that was like a big driver. But when I came to revisit an interview, I just really enjoyed my conversations with the current students. And I think just finding, yes, and Fitz was at my interview, but finding people that you can connect with just during the interview process, I think going with your gut feeling about the people is the most important part, because you can get a great education at a lot of these MD PhD programs, but it's a long time. You're going to be with these people for a long time. So I think that's also really important. And the sun does not hurt, but the rent does, but the sun does not hurt.
I completely agree with Kristie. I feel like I was also similar in the same boat. Going to the socials were actually really helpful because, it's one thing going to this especially during second look, it's one thing going to the events and learning about all the stats of, how many students get in and how many papers are published, all those things. It's another thing seeing students interact with one another. And I think that tells you so much about the collegiality of a certain institution, of how close students are with one another. I think that's one thing that really stood out for me for UCLA in particular. So I think that was one of the decisive factors. Another is just the flexibility built into the program. You can literally decide when to do your PhD, whether you want to do clerkship, your clinicals first and then PhD or vice versa. It's incredibly flexible. There's a lot of mentorship built in. So yeah, those are some of the reasons, but completely agree with you guys. And the sun does not hurt. I don't mind the weather.
I don't want to suck up too much oxygen, but since we've been getting a good amount of questions from folks who are interested in SST, I chose UCLA because of the fact that we actually have like a solid cohort of people compared to other programs. Other programs that I was looking at had maybe like 1 or 2 or 3 people spanning all 8 years, but UCLA has like really made the effort of actually taking a couple folks each year. And so we have a really nice cohort of folks who are doing a lot of very similar work, certainly employing, the same, like similar methods. And I also came here because of faculty. I had read a couple of the folks who work here as an undergraduate in like intro classes, and they have been really formative about how I, think about the world, and, the possibility of like working with them as like my dissertation advisors was like really, really exciting. And it's actually just kind of grown. We recently got Helena Hansen from NYU, who for me was also kind of formative in undergrad. And then her coming here like a couple years back was also just like, and that came after I had already chosen UCLA, which was kind of like icing on the cake. So that was it. Like Kristie said, I think it, in terms of making a decision, really the people actually like really, really matter in terms of like who you want to work with, like research wise. In addition to also like the, your colleagues. And that being said, I also just like have actually really enjoyed also just being able to interact with folks in so many different disciplines. I feel like it's also been really, like I think the collegiality of our program is something that is really strong. And because I feel like there's other programs that might be a little like, it might feel like a lot more competitive, but I feel like here it's pretty chill. I feel like in like a very like supportive, like welcoming way, like regardless of what discipline you're in.
I agree with all of that. I'm sorry, I just don't want to take up too much space. Also, I think honestly, like this is a really personal decision that you guys are going to probably have to make, and everybody's variables are going to be different. They're going to hold different weight. Some people, family really, really matters, and needing to be present is something that you're gonna have to take into account. Some people, not so much. For me, again, it comes back to also like for sure the students. I feel like I've already found ride or dies here, and I'm only in my first few months. It feels like it's crazy. And the other thing is like, it's not just MSTP. Like even though, and I also like, I don't know, now I'm getting into tangents, but we're not just like a little bubble outside of the med school class. We're very much integrated. And a lot of my ride or dies are MD only or whatever you want to call it. But a lot of them are also in the MSTP, but we don't treat each other differently. Many of the MDs don't even know that certain people are MSTPs because there's no like air of competition or anything. We're all just like at the same level. We don't know what we're doing, and we're all just trying to figure it out, and that's okay. And there's no competition. It's really just like, how do we band together and become successful physicians down the line, and hopefully help other people. So I don't know, that's very, very broad, but that is one of the reasons that drew me to UCLA, and it might be different for you. So, yeah.
Perfect. The next question is, I want to touch on the student experience. We've talked a lot about what it's like to be in our program, how we're pretty chill, and it's great being in LA for this really long program. So definitely choose a place based on the people and the place that makes you feel happy. So I want to do some quick little questions to address unique aspects of the student experience in our program. So George, could you briefly talk about what it's like applying to the Caltech part of the program and how your trajectory is a little different than the UCLA program?
Yeah, definitely. I can go into that. So a couple of things with regards to the application process, it's pretty much identical. So you're going through the entire application process. Within the application, you can indicate that you're interested in Caltech, and then you can also list certain PIs or professors at Caltech that you'd be interested in. So kind of like a 30,000 foot overview of the program. The way it would work is you do your medical curriculum here at UCLA, and then for your graduate work, you take time off, technically leave of absence, and then go to Caltech for that period of time. With regards to just generally, Caltech has really nice research interests, and one thing, and I'd like to get Kristie's thoughts as well, but I feel like Caltech's research is very focused on a few things. It's 1 inch wide, a mile deep for those few topics, whereas at UCLA, there's a wide breadth of different research opportunities, and I think if there's something that you're interested in at Caltech, I think you should definitely go for it, and especially if you get a chance, speak to the PIs and kind of exchange ideas. But if you're still open to different research opportunities, I think it's worth doing rotations at UCLA as well, just because of how much research opportunities there are. In general, Caltech's research tends to be more heavy on the either basic science side or the engineering side. But yeah, those are just some overall things to keep in mind when applying to that component. But yeah, I can definitely leave my information here. Feel free to reach out if you're interested in the Caltech component. I'd be more than happy to answer specifics. Yeah.
Perfect. And I kind of have a little quick question for each of you about unique things that you can speak on. So Daniel, any advice for people interested in social science track or preparing to apply?
I would say definitely try to have a good writing sample. I think so a couple folks asked this, and I will say it doesn't have to be a publication. I hadn't published anything when I applied. I had written a senior honors thesis, and actually my writing sample ended up being an excerpt from that I actually did rework a little bit just to make it a little bit, because it had been like 3 years or whatever since I had written. So I did rework, the writing sample that I did submit. But I would say for us, there is kind of that added weight to having a writing sample, just because by virtue of the fact that really, at least in anthropology, our dissertation is very often, we actually try to publish our dissertation as a book. And so writing is something that's really, really emphasized. And so for us, definitely that kind of is something to consider in terms of, if you're considering SST, is really working on having a good writing sample.
Thank you. Kristie, I have a question for you as someone who's third year into the PhD. You've gone through the first big transition. What was that like, leaving med school, starting the PhD, and then now in a couple years thinking about going back?
Stressful, but I think one thing that maybe has not been emphasized in this presentation is one thing. Oh, some people asked in the Q&A, what's one thing you wish you knew before you start MSTP? It's how stressful the transitions are, because I think you really have to put on a different hat. And I think med school is more similar to undergrad, at least the didactic part. So it's a little bit easier and there's a lot of people, but when you start your PhD, it's kind of lonely because your labs could be of varying sizes, and I'm sure for Daniel's one in social sciences, you're kind of more on your own. So it's hard to navigate that initial part. I think for me, having not taken a gap year, I felt like I could have used more research experience, to be honest. So I spent a lot of time learning a lot of technical things, and thankfully I have a very supportive mentor and really supportive lab environment who helped me transition well, and also other upperclassmen in the MSTP who gave a lot of advice. I remember crying at a women in MSTP event, drinking wine, but everybody was very supportive. And so right now I feel comfortable where I am in my PhD. I think I finally know how to do things. And then looking forward to going back to med school. I don't know, I can let Fitz take that one.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Fitz is the only one who's really gotten the full MD PhD experience here. So what was that like? And any reflections in your final year?
I mean, are we talking about surgical reflections? That's a medical joke. But sorry, too soon. It's like when you peel some. I think, when you start out, how do I say this? It all ends. I feel like you start out with so many interests. And I think, there's a running joke, which is that the MSTP is the path people who cannot make decisions choose. I think, it's a joke that kind of has some significant truth to it. And that truth is that if you do anything long enough, if you're alive long enough, your interests are going to change, right? You have that potential. And at any point in time, if your interests change, you can choose to evolve with said new interests or remain in the old path, right? So I think the MSTP kind of offers that, right? For example, I can say that I didn't come in knowing anything about ophthalmology. I knew that people had eyeballs and that most people, most of the time people saw through them, but I knew nothing else about it. I had no interest in it. And now clinically, it's the thing that I think is most fascinating. And I could wax philosophical about how impactful vision is, in people's lives, and probably the best or the most important sense that we have. But the main point, I think, what I took away from the whole thing is you're going to grow, you're going to change, and what better way? I mean, at least for me, what better way to grow and change than to go through training that you like? And I changed a lot. I really changed a lot. I grew to do things that I like. I found things that I like. And so I think it's been good. In terms of the transitions, I think they can be jarring because I think you get used to a certain way of doing things, right? You start in medical school. I remember my first week in medical school was very challenging. Where start out triple undergrad where there was only one answer. And then the first couple of days of medical school talking about differential. And for whatever reason, my mind. Sorry about that.
You're going in and out.
Can you hear me?
Come back. Yes.
Yeah. So sorry about that. So I came in with this idea that there's only one correct answer. And then I had to rewire my head to understand what a differential was. I guess I hadn't watched enough TV shows to even know what the word meant, which is that there are multiple things it could be. And it literally took 2 years to go to switch with this idea that, this patient that I'm looking at, this question that I'm looking at could be multiple things, right? And then after that, I went to PhD, and that was, I had to relearn a different way and then learn a different way of, critical thinking and a different way of studying and understanding things. And then that, as soon as I got used to that, I returned to medical school. And so, but I think the beautiful thing about this kind of training is that you learn to be able to think, right? There's a different way that medicine and medical doctors see and think. And, general training kind of teaches you to do that. And that's good, right? The benefit that we have from this kind of training is that you get to be able to apply a different kind of thinking and see different kinds of problems that people don't think or don't see. And then you also grow the tools and, learn how to think about those kinds of questions. And I think our patients are going to be significant beneficiaries of the skill set of thinking that we developed through this program. So that's something I took away from it. And I don't think I knew that was going to be the biggest thing that I take away from the whole thing. Yeah.
All right. And just on a final note, I'll kick it off with Jacqui, since you're MS1 finishing kind of up your first year already, and probably you and George are the closest to applying. What advice do you have for people thinking about this path or maybe even applying this cycle?
Yeah, good question. Big one. I would say there's so many things that I could say here. I think one thing is knowing that also, like, you have to choose a program, that you have power in this kind of application cycle as well. And knowing that, like, I don't know, I think it's really important to realize that you want to make sure that you're in a place you want to be in for 8 years, right? So what I did was, before even kind of applying to certain schools, I did so much research on every institution that I applied to. And then once I got into interviews or got accepted to schools, I said, okay, what labs can I see myself in? And not even just based on publications or prestige of the lab, but I wanted to make sure, what's the lab environment like, and what are the dynamics like? So I would request to have one-on-one talks with everybody in each lab that I was interested in. So it was kind of excessive, but I've never, I don't know how to say it, like, I've never really felt like I was entering a lab blind because of that, or like kind of an experience blind because of that. And due to kind of vetting every experience that I've had, I feel like I've gotten phenomenal mentors out of it. I've gotten phenomenal friendships, great projects. And I don't know, I feel much more kind of confident with every step that I take, because I'm willing to just send a cold email and ask people, like, you know, what is it really like being there? So I think that's one thing I don't see, you know, lots of people do, and I'm just very happy that I was able to do it. But it's also one of the reasons why I said UCLA is 100% the reason why why I want to be a physician in kind of UCLA is 100% the place that I want to kind of learn and train in. So yeah, I think I would just tell the applicants that it's going to be okay, and you guys are going to figure it out, but make sure that I don't know, you take every step and make sure that you vet every kind of opportunity that comes your way. That's what I would say.
Perfect, thanks. Does anyone else have any final words of encouragement that they want to add before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I guess briefly about, I think some people asked about the timeline. And I think one thing to keep in mind for MSTP or MD PhD programs is the interview is a little bit different than like the normal med school process, because they have way more interviews for each school in general than MSTPs do. Like, for example, I think UCLA has like 5 per year, so it's once per month. So I think that's just one thing you want to keep in mind when you're doing the timeline thing, because I was also a little bit late, and I think that it made me really stressed out. So I think just you being here at this panel, like, shows that you're trying to prepare for this. So I think like just being prepared before you apply is like really important. And then other than that, it's just kind of doing it. And it's always going to look more scary before you do it than when you're doing it. And I think that applies to like everything in the program. So good luck, everybody.
I'd say, learn to believe in yourself. I think the most important thing is, right, I still kind of have to tell my family what it is that I do, even when I'm still figuring out what it is that I do. Because when you have people who have done things that you want to do, it's easier because you kind of have a blueprint. When you're the first in your family, in your area, maybe in your school, to think of a certain thing, it doesn't mean that it's insurmountable. It's kind of challenging and it's different. So I think having a belief in yourself, being very honest with yourself, both things are very important, right? You can have a significant belief in yourself and also be a little delusional, right? I think it's important to be honest with yourself, right? Because if you're honest with yourself, I think you have a chance to set yourself up for success, right? That means you're going to know what your deficiencies are, right? Because I think part of any program, whether medicine, PhD, MD, PhD, whatever, beyond undergrad is going to be a self-assessment that you have to do, right? To know where it is that you are going to need help. That's going to allow you to then find opportunities to grow yourself and to improve yourself so that you can put your best foot forward. So I think that's what's going to allow you to be successful, whether you choose to apply here, whether you choose to go here ultimately, or anywhere that you choose. I think those are the 2 things that I would leave you with. And I guess the third would be to be curious. Be curious about the world and about yourself, and all will be well.
Just one other quick thing. I mean, that was amazing. And every time Fitz talks, if anything, it's for me as well. It's so incredibly encouraging. So thank you. I really appreciate it. But another thing I want to mention is we were all in your same shoes like only a few years ago. And it was because of the encouragement and like talking to upperclassmen, bugging them, asking them questions that, we were able to get to this point. So, reach out to people around you, talk to others, ask good questions, ask people why they chose what they did and why they didn't do something else. I mean, we're here for you. Make sure to talk to upperclassmen in your school, or, if you come to UCLA or anywhere, just reach out. We're here for you. But it's definitely, in retrospect, I'm glad I made this decision. We're glad we made these decisions. And I think it's a difficult decision to make, but at the end of the day, if this is something you're passionate about, it's definitely worth pursuing. Even though it's a long endeavor, it's definitely worth it.
All right, with that, we're going to end tonight's panel. Thank you all so much for coming. We hope this was helpful. We hope we answered your questions. And if you have remaining questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you and have a great rest of your week.